Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 6 of biogeography. We're getting closer and closer to the midpoint of the semester, so I just wanted to thank you all for hanging tough and being diligent with turning in your work and sticking with things during these difficult times. So I wanted to just continue our conversation about speciation and extinction this week. And again, this one's going to be a bit of a shorter lecture, kind of giving you a little bit of a break with content. But before we talk about speciation, finish up speciation and extinction, I wanted to review just briefly some of your answers from the question of the week from week 4, where I asked, what is a species? And as we talked about in last week's lecture, there are a lot of different definitions for species, and a lot of you all gave very good answers. If you go back and look at those answers, you'll recognize some of the species concepts that we talked about last week. But the take home for this is that there's no one definition that fits all cases. And so, when we're talking about species, as I mentioned last week, and what constitutes a species, it's important that we give that definition so that those who we're talking to within an academic context know what are the boundaries of what we're able to understand as a species or not. And so what you're going to want to do in studying for the midterm exam, and then also just kind of driving this concept home, is to go back to your definition of what a species is and try to think of one or two cases where that definition wouldn't apply, where you wouldn't be able to apply that definition to species that you might be thinking about, okay? Because that way we can really have a better understanding of those definitions. All right, so wanted to continue talking about speciation and extinction. And so we talked about definitions, but then we can think about speciation from a time perspective, right? A temporal perspective, and the tempo of speciation. And so there are two terms here that are important, that are going to be important for you all to understand. And it's the speed or the rate at which speciation occurs. And so we can get an idea, we have an idea of what constitutes a species in different cases, but at what speed, at what rate does the formation of new species happens? And one term that we can use to describe the tempo of speciation is gradualism, right? And gradualism tempo is small, steady, incremental changes that lead to speciation, right? So it's a little bit of tinkering at a pretty consistent, constant rate that leads to new species. Now, the second definition, or the second type of speciation tempo or speciation rate, is called punctuated equilibrium, and that is defined as large, rapid, and infrequent changes that lead to new species, right? And so, instead of having, you can think of this from the tempo of speciation similar to different types of studying, right? And so gradualism would be, looking at the material every day, staying consistent with it, and making small changes in your understanding, versus punctuated equilibrium, which would be the equivalent to cramming at the last minute, or doing a lot of studying all at once, okay? And to represent that, here is a graph or schematic looking at an evolutionary tree and the different tempos of speciation. So we have on the left-hand side the gradualism model, and you can see from at the bottom this original ancestral species, and over time the rate at which those species changes, or that population changes into new species, is relatively constant. There's about equal space between each butterfly on each branch, versus the punctuated equilibrium model, where you see that the time between the formation of different species is irregular, right? And you can even see this middle fork of this tree, this ancestral species largely remains unchanged over time. And then the two other species, the two other sister species, have different rates of change, okay? And so the take-home message for this is that there's a different speed or a different rate at which changes happen within a population that might lead to different species. So the next question is, which one is more common and why? And that's a good question. So I want you all to think about that, and I'll come back to that answer later on in the lecture. All right, but think about which one do you think is more common based on what you understand about environments and how they change and how frequently they change. Okay, so one of the things that we talk about when we're discussing species is maintaining a species. If we think back to the chipmunks and the squirrels on either end of the Grand Canyon, right, and how those four populations became distinct species because they maintained a distance between them, a vicariance event. They were separated by geography. But, for other species, sympatric species or sympatric speciation, where there's new species popping up in the same geographical area, there has to be some other mechanism for maintaining that species, to maintain those distinct populations. All right? And so we can think about speciation and maintaining species based on reproductive isolation. So if certain members of a population stop breeding with each other, and over time, they can become distinct species. All right, so no hanky-panky between members of the same population. And so there's two different classes that we can talk about from a reproductive standpoint that help maintain species. And we can think of things as pre-zygotic barriers, so barriers that prevent the formation of a zygote, right? Mechanisms that prevent successful mating. And then we can think about post-zygotic barriers. So barriers that maintain the reproductive isolation of populations that prevent the formation of a successful hybrid. And by successful hybrid, we mean an offspring of two members of different species or two members of a population. That hybrid is able to reproduce young of their own, reproduce offspring of their own. Okay, so let's go over some examples of these pre and post zygotic barriers. All right, and so now I'm going to show you several pictures of things. And as you're seeing these, I want you all to try to guess what you think these things are. So here's the first picture. And the second one. And now the third one. What do you think these are? Now these are scanning electron microscope photos, so they're very small. What are these things? If you guess that they are all pictures of different damselfly penises, then you get a gold star for the week. So, yes, these are in fact all different pictures of damselfly penises. And the reason why I'm showing you damselfly penises is to drive home this point of a pre-zygotic barrier. And one of the ways that pre-zygotic barriers are established and maintained is through specialized genitalia. All right? And you can see from these pictures that all of these damselfly penises have a unique shape to them. And they are essentially a key that fits the lock for female damselflies. And so a damselfly with any one of these unique shaped penises is only able to mate with female damselflies of the same species. And this is one of the ways that pre-zygotic barriers are maintained. So even if, the damselfly male in this top photo were going to try to mate with a damselfly female that was compatible with the second photo, they would not be able to successfully mate because the key does not fit the lock. Okay, so that's one example of a prezygotic barrier, specialized genitalia. Another prezygotic barrier is one that we've discussed already in class when we're thinking about different species and species concepts. So we all have pictures of these different species of frogs, and all of these frogs, I think except for maybe one of them, all live within the same environment. Okay? But they all have distinct calls. And as I mentioned before, that many species of female frogs can only hear the calls from male species. So it's not just that females in some cases are only interested in hearing a particular call, but different species of frogs have become so specialized that the females only have auditory physiology that can hear the calls of their males. So it's sort of similar to how human beings cannot hear certain frequencies of other animals' communications. You think about elephants. Human beings, we don't possess the auditory physiology to perceive of the low frequencies that elephants communicate in. Okay, and so for frog species, females can't even hear the calls of males of a different species. Okay, so that's another way that prezygotic barriers are maintained. So now we can pivot to postzygotic barriers. So here's a picture of a horse and a picture of a donkey. And of course, these two different species are capable of making a hybrid. But as some of you may know, a donkey and a horse produce a mule. And a mule is sterile. It's incapable of successfully reproducing. Okay, and so this is an example of a post-zygotic barrier, a barrier that maintains species after a zygote is formed. And so because a horse and a donkey are fairly closely related, they haven't lost their ability to successfully produce a zygote or successfully produce an offspring. But because their species are just distantly related enough, that hybrid is not born with reproductive cells. So their mules are not able to mate with other mules and produce mules. You have to mate a horse and a donkey. Okay, so that's an example of a post-zygotic barrier. So here's a schematic that you might want to save and take a look at. It outlines some other examples of prezygotic and post-zygotic barriers for maintaining species. Okay, so other examples including behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, meaning mating at different times of the day, mechanical isolation, which we talked about, and different things like that. Okay, so pre- and post-zygotic barriers, different ways of maintaining species. And just to sort of have a little bit of fun with the different ways in which animals can interbreed and produce hybrids, here are some pictures of some hybrids that you may think are not real or may have been photoshopped, but actually exist. So here is a picture of a zorse, which is a horse and zebra hybrid. Okay, and so this hasn't been photoshopped. This is an actual animal, and you can see the different colorations. Here is a liger, a hybrid of a tiger and a lion. All right, and you can see the characteristics of either one. And one that's really popular here in the U.S., a beefalo, which is a cow hybridized with a buffalo. And you can imagine all the different reasons why human beings would be interested in some of these organisms. And it's pretty rare that we see these types of hybrids between species in outside of a human hybridization context. And that's because the species that these two organisms represent are both geographically or behaviorally isolated, and often do not form these hybrids. Although tigers and lions had much more contiguous habitat in the past, but again, human beings are a big source of why we see these hybrids. Okay, pretty interesting stuff. All right, so we talked about speciation, the formation of species, but of course, all things come to an end. And we're talking about now extinction, which is the fate of all species. All species are going to go extinct. The dodo went extinct, largely because of human populations. Here is a picture of a passenger pigeon, which was at one time the most numerous bird species on the planet here in North America. But after European colonization and overexploitation of this species, the passenger pigeon went extinct around the turn of the 20th century, so about 100 years ago. And then, of course, the Tasmanian tiger, which is actually a marsupial carnivore, a member of a genus that's no longer around. And it was called a Tasmanian tiger by white settlers because of the stripes, but it's actually closer to a dingo or a canid species, but it's actually not a canid. It's sort of its own unique genus as well. But the Tasmanian tiger has gone extinct, right? And so, these species have gone extinct in large part because of settler colonialism. But even without human beings causing the extinctions of these species that are here and many others that are going extinct, the fate of all species is that they will eventually no longer exist. And this is the case for humans. Even human beings, Homo sapiens, will one day no longer exist. Now, that doesn't mean that parts of us, parts of our DNA, parts of who we were or any of these other species disappears forever, although that can be the case. So the question is, will our lineage continue? Because, like all species, we are made up of our ancestral species. We have characteristics that we've inherited over the years that are representative of who our forebearers were. In the same way that your relatives, your ancestors, every single one of your ancestors is no longer, if you go back far enough, is no longer living, but part of them exists within you. Whether that be your mannerisms, your culture, your DNA, those sorts of things. Okay. And so we can look at the evolution of hominid species. Excuse me. And all of the ones except for Homo sapiens are no longer around, but they're characteristics of those previous species that are present within ours today. Okay, and so the question is, who's going to exist after we're gone? Homo sapiens are the last member of the genus Homo, and so there may be no more of our lineage around if we don't evolve into something else. So that's an interesting question. So evolutionary history is a race where no single species finishes the race, right? As we were talking about. And again, to drive this point home, the question is, is a given lineage going to run this race like a relay in which they pass on their genes, pass on their characteristics to the next species that evolves from that population? So we can think about dinosaurs to birds and many other species, Homo erectus to Homo sapien, that being a relay race where one member drops out. Or can we have a race, or will a given species' fate be a hurdle fall in which their entire lineage goes extinct and there's no one left to carry on that lineage, and that entire sort of group of unique evolutionary characteristics disappears from the face of the earth. Okay, and so there have been many mass extinctions on the planet in which entire lineages have disappeared, and this is one of the things that's sort of scary for existing species, because we all depend on other species to survive. And so when these mass extinctions come up, it can be really precarious for other life on the planet. And so we can think about the Cretaceous extinction, in which bye-bye the dinosaurs largely died out. Fortunately enough, there were some lineages that were able to weather this cataclysmic event, and those lineages evolved into bird species, but dinosaurs went extinct. Okay. And, on the scale of mass extinctions, the dinosaur extinction was actually relatively mild. In the Permian extinction, about 250 million years ago, so this is the extinction that eventually gave rise to the dinosaurs, the Triassic period, 96% of all marine life on the planet, according to the fossil record and what human beings understand of the fossil record, disappeared. And so that was a really serious extinction. And the main cause of these extinctions, even the dinosaur extinction, but particularly when we look further back in the past, the main cause of these extinctions is somewhat unclear. Now, we do know in terms of the dinosaurs that a meteor, the size of Texas, hit the Earth in what's now the Yucatan Peninsula. And certainly that impact had a cataclysmic effect on, the other species that were there. But there were certainly other contributing factors to why the dinosaurs went extinct. And when we look at the Permian extinction 250 million years ago, the causes of that extinction, or the main cause of that extinction, is not always clear. And we can look at human extinction, human-caused extinction, right? So we are in the midst of the sixth mass extinction, and this extinction, at least on a time scale, is making the other ones look quite mild in comparison. The rate of species disappearing from the planet right now, particularly in the last 500 years, is faster than we've ever experienced, and life has experienced on this planet. Okay, and so humans are becoming, or have become, a source of rapid extinction. And an interesting book that looks at what the aftermath of the planet might look like, or might be, if human beings were to rapidly go extinct or rapidly disappear from the planet, is a book by Alan Weisman called The World Without Us. And it's actually a fascinating read in looking at how the planet would reclaim space from what human beings have done over the last, particularly over the last 500 years or so. Okay, so mass extinctions are things that are that we've certainly seen before on this planet, that have certainly happened before on this planet, but there are hard long times in store for those that survive in the aftermath of a rapid extinction. And so why does human-induced extinction matter, and how is it different? Well, I just talked about that. The speed and the scale at which the extinction is happening is why it matters and how it's different. Okay, so when we think about extinctions, not just mass extinctions, but extinctions of particular lineages, there's multiple causes. There can be abiotic causes, natural disaster, like a meteor impact or volcanic eruption, or a particularly destructive storm. Okay, changing environments can be another source, abiotic source of extinction. We can think about the Pleistocene or the Ice Age, that certainly resulted in the extinction of species. Predators can be a source of extinction. Predators exhausting a particular food source. Disease can be another source of extinction. Low population change. All of these things can be abiotic sources of extinctions. So as I mentioned before, many times more species have gone extinct than are alive today, than are extant today, and so that's the fate of all species. But important terms to remember are local extinction. So we can talk about the disappearance of a particular members of a population for in a certain area, and that differs from a species extinction, which is the loss of an entire lineage from the face of the earth. And so we can think about local extinction. We can think about elk or buffalo or even condors, which once existed across different geographies in North America, but again, due to settler colonialism, elk are no longer present in this region of the world, with the exception of places like Kentucky and other places where those elk were brought from the west, where they weren't locally extinct. But certainly buffalo don't exist wild in these areas, even though they used to. So that's local extinction. And then species extinction would be something that may be a little bit more familiar, like the disappearance of the passenger pigeon or the dodos. You can't find any of those species anywhere in the world. So both can be negative, have negative impacts on environments and those species that are still living. But certainly species extinction is the more devastating, or the more damaging extinction, where you can't get those species back. Okay, so that's all we have for this week. And pivoting to next week, we're going to be talking about ecosystems and ecosystem relationships. Going to have a lot of really cool videos and examples of the ways in which species interact with each other. So I'm really excited about the next couple of weeks before the midterm exam. But to kick things off, for the question of the week for this week is, what is an ecosystem? Okay, and again, like other questions of the week, I'm not grading you on whether or not you're right or wrong. I'm interested in what you all understand before we talk about a concept. Okay, so take some time to go on to click the link on the Google Drive and answer this question: what is an ecosystem? All right. Some reminders for the week. We're back to having a reflection, so there's going to be a podcast, Paleontology from the Ologies podcast, that I think you all will really enjoy. It talks about dinosaurs. It talks about the field of paleontology, and a lot of interesting themes that we've covered in terms of speciation and particularly extinction. So do check that out. And remember that the reflection for this podcast is due this coming Sunday. All right. So I will post this podcast and the reflection tomorrow. And that should give you plenty of time to listen to it and answer the reflection questions. Okay. All right. So that's all I have for this week. I hope you all are doing as well as can be considered. Please continue to take care of each other, to wear your mask, to wash your hands, and to stay as healthy as you possibly can. And again, if you want to reach out and talk about the material, or talk about anything that's going on in terms of classes in school and things like that, please do drop by office hours on Wednesdays from 1 to 3, or 1:30 to 2:30, or just send me an email, and we can schedule a time to talk. All right. Hope you all have a good week.